Okay, everybody, here we are in the CoVida conversations, the co-life. What's possible now that wasn't possible 3 months ago? And I've been asking some of my smartest, long-term, wise colleagues this question of, Milton Friedman said, only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. So how do we articulate in this moment of fluidity ideas that we want lying around when the pandemic clears? So over to you, Carolyn Baker, and let us know a little bit about yourself and then your thoughts on this question.
Sure. Thank you, Vicki, for having me. As you know, I've been writing and teaching about the collapse of industrial civilization for about 13 years. My focus has been almost entirely on emotional and spiritual preparation for it and learning the psycho-spiritual skills that will support us as we navigate this tremendous unraveling. So right now we have some choices and we should seize these choices while we have them. But what's also true is that our choices are going to become increasingly limited by the pandemic as it continues and as all systems collapse. If we just look right now at the different systems, the economy, healthcare, education, churches, agriculture, law enforcement, transportation, you name it. Right now, we're thinking primarily logistically, but our options are dwindling by the minute. And at the moment, we're focused on these options, and that's a good thing. And we also have to consider that collapse itself is not just an opportunity, but it's an ordeal on a host of levels. The literal meaning of that word ordeal is severe trial, test by courage or patience, anything which tests character or endurance. And so it's very, very important to hold the reality of ordeal alongside the reality of options and opportunity. So the question for all of us is, what psycho-spiritual skills do we have that we can utilize in the throes of the ordeal, which is not going to be short in duration? And I've been framing this. One of the ideas that's been laying around for me has been the notion of a planetary rite of passage. I've been talking about this for years, and I have a video on YouTube of a presentation that I gave on this topic in Eugene, Oregon, a year ago last month. So, the rite of passage literally was that experience that young people had in an indigenous tribe at about the age of puberty, in which they had to go out in nature with the elders and go through some sort of ordeal, which would test them, not just physically, but it would test them emotionally and spiritually. And they would come out of that ordeal probably many, many years wiser than if they had not gone through it. And then they went back to the community and there was a great celebration, but it changed them forever. And I believe that we are, with climate catastrophe, with the pandemic, with whatever we're facing right now, we're in the throes of a planetary rite of passage. That's going to be, I think, a pretty grinding ordeal that also has the power to transform us individually and as communities. And I've noticed recently, a friend of mine, a colleague of mine, Richard Rohr, who's a radical Franciscan priest in Albuquerque, wrote a book a long time ago on this rite of passage or initiation. And he talks about 5 things that we can learn from it. And these are not easy lessons, but I think they're just part of being whole, adult human beings on this planet right now. The first is the lesson that life is hard, and that might sound like duh, but all great spiritual teachings, all great wisdom is about what we do with our pain. And so in a rite of passage in an ancient culture, the young person was taught not to run from their pain, not to try to get rid of it, but to learn the lessons of it. And so that's a big one for us right now, is what is this rite of passage trying to teach me or my community? And, you know, we've got this notion in Western culture that you deal with pain by being a warrior. You know, right now we're making war on this virus. We're at war with this virus. Unfortunately, Americans tend to come back to everything, you know, war as a solution for everything. And the ego or the false self within us wants to believe that life isn't hard and we're entitled to be comfortable, safe, pain-free. But we're going to be learning, and we're already learning in very painful ways, that life is hard. And there are some blessings in that, there's some good things in that, but we have to come back to that basic adult reality. A second intention of this rite of passage, I think, is you are not important. Now, the ego immediately goes, what do you mean I'm not important? I'm very special. I'm a human being. That's not to say that you're not important as a human being. You are an invaluable expression of the sacred. We all are, but we're not special. And what makes any of us important is not the accomplishment of our egos, but the greater self, the sacred self that's working through us. And when we really get this, we actually become more important than we could ever be otherwise, because the rite of passage teaches us the limitations of our humanity. And boy, are we finding that out now. So for all of the patriotic bluster that we're Americans, we shouldn't have to be going through this crisis, we're going to overcome it because we're Americans, you know, that's pretty ridiculous. We're part of a human race that is limited and fallible, but not invincible. The third intention of a rite of passage is your life is not about you. Life is not about you, but you're about life. Your life is not your own. You're an instance of a universal and even eternal pattern. Life is giving itself to you. And once you know that your life is not about you, then you can also trust, as Gandhi did, that one's life is one's message. And it gives you an amazing confidence that, you know, and sometimes that could even look like brashness about your own life, precisely because it's no longer a small life and it's no longer just you, and it's your life and your needs. So I think we're seeing this tremendous amount right now in the suffering and pain that people are going through, and the ways they're reaching out and helping each other and sacrificing. People are really learning, whether they're conscious of it or not, that their lives are not about themselves and that life is not about them. A fourth and really important intention that many, many people are learning right now is you're not in control. And that's probably the most difficult, if not impossible, for us in Western culture to learn. We've got this notion that if you're out of control, that's a bad thing. If you're in control, that's a good thing. But as we know, resilience is the space in between. A resilient person knows that they aren't in control, and they also realize that they won't necessarily die if they aren't in control. So a resilient person in 2020 realizes that at this moment, the crisis is in control. And what we need to do is respond to it by using all the tools that I've talked about in my work for 13 years, such as feeling our feelings and managing our feelings and learning how to communicate skillfully, building and strengthening community relationships, developing spiritual practices and rituals for sustaining ourselves, and of course, good self-care. So finally, the last intention, and we don't like to hear this, but the older we get, I think, the more open to it we are, and that is you're going to die. Doing everything in our power to live well and experience the fullness and richness of life, this rite of passage will challenge us to live well and die wise. And, you know, I say to people, if you haven't read Stephen Jenkinson's book, Die Wise, I heartily encourage folks to do so. Screaming loudly at us at every turn in this collapse is death. And of course, through the pandemic, which is causing the death of, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not at some point, I've heard epidemiologists talk about millions of people. And so there's a beautiful thing in dealing with death, where paradoxically, it enriches our appreciation of life and our ability to really savor it. So those are my thoughts on where we are right now.
Wow. Whew. I'm just like drinking it in. I think it's so wise. So, yeah, I find that the things you're talking about are extremely uncomfortable for people who have rarely peaked out, peak is in peaking,
Right.
of the context that's offered to us in this particular cultural, economic, social system that we live inside of. Um, I don't, when I talk about death, and I've been thinking and talking about it quite a bit, people are not so happy to hear about that. And one of the things, one of the cross currents in what you're saying is, a lot of these notions about what's hitting us through this crisis, and what we need to surrender, that these, even though the virus is just, the solutions are unjust.
Mm-hmm.
And it's, people are scrambling for the thing that gives them the ability to survive a moment. They're not thinking about, good death. They're thinking about, like, I can't feed my family next week.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sort of bonds us closer to the what I call the sow with the poisoned milk, the economy. We just grab onto the nipple harder and just try to, squeeze more money out of that system, because, and we feel that justice is making sure that more money goes out of the system. And of course, compassion in the moment is that, because people are completely embedded in that system. But it's this rite of passage has the possibility of not touching the people at the top. It has, it's touching the people who are rendered the most vulnerable. So I'd love to hear you reflect a bit on the justice of this situation, and, sort of up and down the scale of class and means, where is the justice in this? How do people at the bottom go through this rite of passage?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a tough question, Carolyn.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So anyway, just give us a few kind of off the top of the head thoughts about that.
Yeah. I don't have much hope for people at the top ever really waking up and seeing that they're going through a rite of passage. Unfortunately, they're probably going to make as much money off the crisis as they can and go to their bunkers and, try to live happily ever after. And some are planning to go to Mars and, whatever. Those of us who are somewhere in the middle, I think it is really incumbent on us, out of compassion, out of justice, to do as much as we can for the people who have much less than we do.
Mm.
To really, that's part of this rite of passage, is, compelling us to be compassionate. And, the more we lose ourselves on many, many levels, we can either become bitter and hardened about that, or we can allow it to break our hearts and break us open. And out of that comes compassion. It's like everybody can take food to a food pantry. I mean, if you're not starving to death, you can share a little of what you have with the food pantry. You can give a few bucks to an organization that is providing food. Everybody can deliver groceries to seniors. I mean, there's so many things we might say, well, those are little things, but they're not little things that we can do. Adopt an animal, for heaven's sake. Animals are getting dumped right and left right now because there's an ignorant belief that somehow the virus can be transmitted through animals. And many people are already thinking, oh my God, I don't have a job. I won't be able to support this animal. So the animals get dumped in shelters. There's all kinds of things that we can do. My heart is breaking as I think of these many people who are dying who can't have their relatives close. They're having to say goodbye on FaceTime. Really? This is just absolutely nightmarish. And what can we do to support those families who are losing loved ones? People aren't going to be having funerals. Can we offer rituals of support to people, even if it's online? I'm just kind of brainstorming here, but I think that there are many things that we who have at least a little can do for people who have nothing.
Wow, that is so beautiful. It's almost like it's redefining surplus. If you have
Yeah.
surplus was in the old days, the pre-virus days, it was basically your ability to consume more. It's like, oh, I have a little extra. Let's see, I want the dress, or I'm going to do this, and I'm guilty of it as much as anybody.
Uh-huh.
Or I'm going to go out to eat. So surplus, what in the self-centered world, pre-virus, pre-solidarity, was for myself, was for buying. And so it just was so interesting for people to think of where do I have more than enough given the current moment?
Yeah.
And what can I do to build the networks, to build mutual aid, to reinforce mutual aid in this time?
Mm-hmm.
And that's something hopefully that can leap across the divide. That's one of the things I'm thinking is like, can we bond to people, and to the wealth of giving and receiving? Yeah, it's if the rich are not going to express, I'm sorry, I mean, I don't mean to diss the rich, but I mean, if the uber rich are not thinking about, see, the thing is like, I'll just say that Werner Erhard one time said this one sentence. I mean, there's been things I carry from him for years. And he was doing some event and he said, I know that there are rich and powerful people in this room, and that you are willing to share the fruits of winning, but you are not willing to share winning. In other words, it's like right now, generosity from our surplus is already working that muscle.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe we can go from there to some sense of shared destiny. And what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
Because as you and I know, it's coming at us. This is just the first wave, the maverick wave. The big one is, and the big ones are on the way. And so just I to whatever degree you're willing to say it, what do you think is the next wave after this one? Just when we've caught our breath and stood up in the shallows.
Right. Well, probably another pandemic, and it may be another version of this one, because Dr. Fauci is telling us it might subside a bit in the summer in warmer weather and then come back with a vengeance in the fall. But as I've been pointing out and publishing in my daily news digest, I try to find articles that connect the dots between climate change and the pandemic, and there are several articles that I've published lately, and they have to do with what is our destruction of the earth, how is that related to creating pandemics, and there are many ways to connect those dots, but one way is if you destroy lots of species whose sole purpose is to consume bacteria and pathogens that make us sick, what do you think is going to happen? We're going into tornado and flood season, hurricane season in the next several months. on top of a pandemic, where are these people who lose their homes going to go? They're not going to go to shelters if we continue to be locked down. So I see many, many waves in this collapse, and climate chaos is, hovering over all of those things and deeply involved in them.
It sounds like the only safe spot is maturity. The only safety is in growing up, and
Oh yeah.
it's fierce right now. It's really fierce.
Well, that's what initiations are. The intention of them, those rites of passage, is to compel people to grow up and become adults.
Well, well, well. Fun times.
Yeah, and I can't help but, after learning a little bit about initiations over the years, there's a part of me that just can't help but fantasize, like, what would it have been like as a young person to have female elders who would have been the grandmothers, the mentors for me? There's a whole bunch of crap in my life I probably wouldn't have had to go through, if I had had that wisdom and maturity and had passed through that ordeal. Maybe I wouldn't have some of the other ordeals that I've had to go through in my life. Who knows?
Yeah, exactly. And just one little side blip, and then we should be kind and make this brief. Is that apparently the virus is killing more men than women.
I saw that.
Very interesting that there's a sturdiness in women, and that's coming to the fore, both in compassion and systems thinking, and in just the immune capacity. And so that's another hope for me, is that part of the maturity is going to be a strengthening of the role of the feminine in our society.
Absolutely.
That can see us through,
Yeah.
whatever through might be.
Yeah.
So anyway, I just thank you so much for this
Oh,
conversation.
you're welcome. Thank you for asking me. It's been great fun and great wisdom.
Yeah, right. Likewise. Okay, so we're going to close it up now. Okay. Yeah.